First week of classes, the weather is good, and you're here. We very much appreciate it. My name is Doug Irwin. I'm a professor in the economics department, co-director of the Political Economy Project. We're very happy to sponsor this event today. Before I get into the main event, I just want to mention that we have a lot of activity and programming this spring. The next event is a week from next Monday. It's Jeffrey Toulis from the University of Texas coming to speak on normalizing Trump. That'll be a week from next Monday here in Rocky One, also at 5 p.m. And we have many, many other events after that as well. Well, this is a very special event. One of the things we do at the Political Economy Project is when faculty or students write books, we like to have an event to celebrate that fact and distribute the books. This book is so hot off the press that we weren't able to get copies for this event. However, Hank Clark, who, if you don't know, you should know, he is the co-director of the Political Economy Project. He has a list, and if you are a student, students only, and would like a copy of the book, please sign in with him, and we hope to get them in about 2 to 3 weeks, and we'll get that copy to you. We do have some future events this spring where we will have the books for the event, but just keep an eye out on those in your email inbox. And if you are not on the PEP email list, please see Hank Clark, and we'll do that forthwith.
That's for free for students.
Yes, the books are free, of course, so we're not selling books. But if you're earning income, you got to pay for it yourself. It's an absolute delight to introduce the two authors of this book right here, Command of Commerce, America's Enduring Economic Power Advantage over China. The origin of this book is incredibly special for us in the Dartmouth community. The origin, and I hope we'll hear that story perhaps with the Q&A, is Ben Vagel here from the class of 22 wrote a senior honors thesis on exactly this topic. He worked with Professor Stephen Brooks in the government department. They turned that into a book. It's now being published by Oxford University Press on a very timely, very important topic. They're both here to talk about their book. I won't introduce Steve Brooks. He's in the government department. You can see him anytime wandering around Silsby, take his class and what have you. But Ben Vagel is from the class of 22. He left Dartmouth and went into consulting for about 2 years, and he joined the staff of the U.S. Treasury Department, where he's working for a committee that looks at foreign investment in the United States. And he's about to leave that position, having spanned 2 administrations, to go to law school. And maybe he can tell us a little bit about that. I won't reveal where he's going to go or thinking about. It's still a little bit uncertain. At any rate, a great welcome to you both. Thank you for being here. And Steve will open it up and then turn it over to Ben.
Well, thank you very much, Doug, for the kind introduction. And one thing I can say is that I've taught in this classroom for 25 years, and it's now finally bright. You know, it's beautiful. So kudos to the renovation process that was done here. Very nice to see all of you. And we'll be talking about this book that Doug has noted that we will be publishing. It could be tomorrow, it could be next week. It's soon. There's also, if you want to kind of more quickly get into what the argument of the book is, there's a foreign affairs article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, and it goes over a lot of the findings from the book. It's just there's no proof for them in the Foreign Affairs article. So in some respects, the Foreign Affairs article has got a lot of the headline results, and if you don't kind of believe them, then you need to read this. Or if you want to know more, you need to know this. This book, when we wrote it, it was designed to address 2 conventional wisdoms. The first conventional wisdom is that the gap between the US and China in terms of economic power, which, 20, 30 years ago was immense, that it had massively shrunk. I'm someone who's worked with Bill Woolforth measuring U.S. power vis-a-vis China for over 20 years. And what we traditionally said, was that the gap militarily and technologically and in economic power was very big. The most recent take that Wolfworth and I had in another foreign affairs article called Multipolarities and Myths is we said the gap's still big militarily because the U.S. is a global military power, whereas China is a regional one. The gap is still big technologically, but what Wolfworth and I said is the gap had shrunk a ton economically. So that's what we wrote 2 years ago. That was before I wrote this book. Now that I've written the book, what I would say is the gap in economic power is still really, really big, like immensely big. So that's the first conventional wisdom and our first kind of answer to it. The second conventional wisdom was if there was some sort of conflict in the world in which the US and China are, fighting, and the most likely obvious scenario would be Taiwan. If such a conflict happened, and if the United States was to want to do, what it did to Russia in terms of cutting it off economically, what would happen? What would happen afterwards? And that was the original question for Ben's thesis, and he provided this really interesting answer, which he'll be talking to you in the second part of the talk. And basically what the answer is that, well, first on the conventional wisdom front, what people said is, yeah, we can cut off China, but if we cut off China because we're so tightly linked to it, unlike Russia, which we don't have very many links to, because we're so tightly linked to China that we can cut off China and hurt it, but we'll hurt ourselves almost as much, if not more. So, in other words, because of the tight relationship, we can hurt China, but the only way to do so is by hurting ourselves. And we address this conventional wisdom, or rather Ben did in his thesis. And what the analysis that he did showed is that that conventional wisdom was not just wrong, it was completely wrong. In that, if the United States were to cut off China, together with its allies, either in cooperation with them, they're voluntarily doing it, or by forcing them to via blockade. But the point is, if China is cut off from the US and its allies, that the damage to China would be at a minimum 5 times more than the damage to the United States. And at a maximum, the damage to China would be 11 times more than the damage to the United States. So Ben will show you the numbers, but they're incredibly large. For China, we're talking about short-term damage at the low end of 15%, at the high end at 51%. So to put this in context, the Great Depression, the first year of it, GDP went down 7% in 1930. The second year, 1931, GDP went down 7%. So for China, we're talking about 2 to 6 years worth of Great Depression level pain. This is regime-ending stuff. This is hugely catastrophic for China. And the point is the US has this capacity to do this. But as Ben will show, and I won't give away the entire punchline, that's if we work with other countries. If we cut off China by ourselves, which we talked about and analyzed hypothetically, but now seems to be happening actually, if we cut off China by ourselves, we get hurt almost as much as China. About 70% as much as China. And so the point is, if you want to hurt China, for whatever reason, you don't do it by cutting off China by yourself. You have to do it with your allies. And we didn't say in this book, but I would say now, you have to have allies in the first place to cut China off with. All right, so those are the 2 conventional wisdoms. Those are answers. You kind of know the main overall punchline of the book. Let me briefly talk about the first part of the book, which is measuring China's economic power in a new way. And basically what we argue is that China's economic power is overstated for 3 key reasons. The first is that analysts do not take firms and globalization properly into account. Traditionally, the way we've measured economic power is to look at it in territorial terms. We've asked what production is happening within the United States, what production is happening within China. You can't do that anymore in today's globalized world. And by the way, this is a key reason why, although we wrote our analysis before Trump was elected and before he did all this tariff stuff, the analysis, in our view, has just as much, if not more relevance for today's world in which he's cutting off the United States from the rest of the world. Because what I'm going to show you, essentially, here, is that the US isn't just kind of doing kind of pretty well vis-a-vis China. It's doing amazingly well. And the US isn't kind of doing like okay or whatever vis-a-vis other countries. The US is dominating the global economy in terms of reaping gains from it. And there, the headline point would be is that when you carefully measure who gets the world's profits, who gets the world's profits, what we found in our analysis is that profits, 38% of them are accrued by US firms. And then in addition, another 9% of world profits are owned by Americans because they own so much of the rest of the world's firms. So put that together, if you do the math, is 47%. 47% of world profits accrue to the United States. That's phenomenal. That's great. That's unbelievable. Why? It's because you have this thing called globalization, and because the US, as the leader of the system, structured globalization in ways to benefit itself. This did not seem to be very well understood today in Washington, D.C. So, we are far ahead of China. We are far ahead in part because we, the United States, control the way globalization works, essentially. Because our firms are the leaders of it. So you have to look at firms and not what's happening within a country. If you look at what's made in China, it's very impressive. But if you look at what Chinese firms make in China, it's much less impressive. And there the point is, a good chunk of China's high technology production, a good chunk of its manufacturing is owned or controlled by foreign firms. It's not Chinese. It's counted as being Chinese because it's in China, but it's not Chinese, especially in a crisis, because the point is, if a firm in China is not Chinese, if it's owned or controlled by foreign firms, it can leave, either if it decides to on the basis of the fact that economic conditions don't make sense in terms of being there anymore, or if the governments of those firms tell them to leave. So you need to look at firms and not at territorial output. The other two problems we noted is that China's unique economic structure makes comparisons problematic. And in turn, a lot of the data that's coming out of China is manipulated. Everyone knows this. The real thing that people don't have a good enough handle on is by how much? By how much? And what we did, and I'll just do this very quickly, because I want to concentrate on this first point before tossing the baton to Ben, is when you factor in point 2 and 3, and you ask yourself, okay, how can we kind of account for these things? How can we get a measure of China's GDP which doesn't suffer from these two problems? And we worked on this, and we can describe how we did it. And the answer that we came to, I'll just get right to the bottom line in the interest of time. The answer that we came to is that China's official GDP is 1/3 higher than it actually is. Not 3%, 33%. And so what that means is that China's economy is not 18 trillion, as it's counted to be. It's more like 12 trillion, which means that China's economy is not roughly 2/3 the size of the United States is. It's more like a little bit of half. And to put that in comparison, the Soviet Union, at the peak of its economic power in the mid-1970s, at that point, Soviet Union GDP was 58% of the United States' GDP. So what we're saying is China has a good long way to go before it would become as economically powerful vis-a-vis the United States as the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. The United States is great. The United States is essentially winning the economic competition. You just have to look at the right numbers to see this. Most important numbers are to look at firms. Point one. A lot of numbers here. I'll walk you quickly through them. Don't get scared. What this is essentially a map of the world's 2,000 largest firms. And you might say, well, that's just 2,000 firms. Like, these firms are massive. These 2,000 firms together are roughly about 60% of world market capitalization. When you're talking about globalization, these firms are basically almost all of it. And so what we did is said, okay, let's look at these 2,000 firms and ask some questions. What sector are they in? And there's 27 sectors here. How much profits do they earn? And then you can then figure out where they're from, which allows you to then understand which country is the base for the most firms that are most profitable in each of these sectors. What's the second country in terms of having the second most number of firms, and so forth. And there's 5 takeaways from each chart, and I'll run through them. The first is the United States is the darkest square here. It's almost always number 1 in 20 out of 27 sectors. The second point, and it's probably hard for you guys to see, is that the magnitude of the advantage between the United States as the number 1 and the number 2 country is almost always extremely large. In 17 of the 20 sectors that the US leads in, it leads by more than 10%. The overall average lead of the US in these 20 sectors is 34.5%. So US is almost always number 1, and number 1 by a ton. Third takeaway is China's the white squares. Don't be distracted by, this is gray actually, but China's the brightest white squares, or Hong Kong. China's on the board. China's on the board. But it only leads in 3 things: banking, construction, and materials. And for reasons of time, I won't be able to unpack this, but I can in the question period, or Ben can. The fact that China leads in banking and construction has no geopolitical significance, at least in terms of power vis-a-vis the United States and its allies. So yeah, they're ahead in that, but it doesn't matter. It does matter that they're ahead in materials. Every day there's 7 articles about the fact that China is ahead in rare earths and that could cause, harm to us. Yeah, they're ahead in that. But the fact that that has geopolitical significance is not because China is strong. It's because the governments of the US and its allies are, in a word, stupid. And that there's an easy way to insulate yourself from this leverage. It's called stockpiles. We could spend 15 or 20 billion and have a stockpile of raw materials, and then this power that China supposedly have would go away. We did this in the Cold War. We need to have a stockpile like that again. End of story. So third takeaway, as I said, is China's on the board, but for the most part, the areas that leading in are not geopolitically significant. Fourth takeaway is that once you factor in US, dark, China, white, almost every other square on this is a US ally, which is really, really, really important today. There's no neutral countries on this chart for the most part. Switzerland's on here 5 times. It cooperates in the sanctions vis-a-vis Ukraine. Ireland's on this chart. It cooperates in the sanctions vis-a-vis Ukraine. So the point of the matter is, and this is, I think, hopefully clear, is that if China is cut off from the firms of the US and its allies, it has nowhere else to go. Nowhere else to go. People often talk about it'll turn to Russia. For what? Russia's on this square, on this chart once. It's number 3 in raw materials. So yeah, they'll be able to get energy from Russia. But what else? Nothing. Russia doesn't make anything, as President Obama said in 2014. So, if the US and its allies cut China off either in a specific sector like semiconductors, like we're doing now, or in a wartime situation, as Ben will talk about, the point is there's nowhere else for China to go. It has to basically do everything itself. And in today's world of complex production, we can talk about this in the question and answer period, whether you're China or the United States, you cannot make everything yourself. It's too complex to make the most complex things. You know, and a clear example here is semiconductors. They're really complex. The most important machine you need to make semiconductors is the lithography machine, which is made by the Dutch firm ASML. It's the only country in the world that can make that machine. It's bigger than this room. Has not dozens or hundreds or tens of thousands of parts. It has millions of parts. Just the laser inside that machine has 457,000 parts. ASML only contributes 15% of the parts that go into the machine. The rest of those parts come from the rest of the world, but actually not the rest of the world. They come from these firms from the United States and its allies. So the point is, if you want to make something, manufacture something like complex, like a semiconductor, a lithography machine, or a fighter jet, anything complex, you need the United States and its allies firms to be working together. If you try to make this yourself, whether you're China or the United States, you will make a crappy product that is extremely expensive and won't really be very good. That's what we may well be in store from if we decide to move towards autarky, which I hope we don't. Final chart that I will show you before passing it to Ben. Well, actually, sorry, 2 more charts, and then I'll pass it to Ben. So the lobbyist thing to do here is, you know, this is all the sectors, to group them together. And so the most important thing is to group together all the high technology industries. And so that's what we're doing on this chart. And what it shows is that in high technology industries, US firms account for 55% of world profits. 55%. Like, if that isn't winning, I don't know what winning is. If that isn't great, I don't know what great is. It's great. And moreover, you know, almost all the rest of the chart are Asian allies, NATO allies, and then Switzerland's up there. So again, like, China's at 8%. That's not enough. It's not strong enough technologically to make most of the things it needs to make. It needs the parts and components and technologies from the US and its allies. This is why when China gets cut off from semiconductor production and the tools to make it, it can't make semiconductors itself very efficiently because it has nowhere else to go. So that's high technology. We also did the same thing for the other 4 sectors: financial and business services, natural resources, consumer industries. And the takeaway here is the US is leading in all of those. The US and its allies together have a minimum of 50% of world profits, and at the top end, 84% of world profits. So the US is doing really, really well in high technology, in everything. And when it works with its allies, it has the capacity to impose tremendous economic pain on a country which is denied access to the firms of its allies and the United States. And that's where Ben will take over.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Well, it's good to be here. I graduated a few years ago, and I'm seeing some familiar faces, but I feel pretty old in that most of the faces here are very unfamiliar. But it's very good to be back at Dartmouth. So these are some of the other slides that we were going to discuss, but just due to time, we're going to get straight to the second part of the presentation, and really the second part of this book that Steve and I wrote together, which is kind of based off of a thesis that I did with Steve now 3 years ago, looking at what the economic cost of a conflict with China would be. So in the first part of this presentation, we really showed that the United States has a tremendous amount of economic power, especially with its allies. And the question then becomes whether the United States can convert that economic power into economic leverage. And I think one of the most interesting ways in which to think about that question is just to consider if the United States and its allies could sanction a really big economy like the economy of China. A pretty salient scenario there is if China were to invade Taiwan and then the US and its allies were to respond with sanctions. And the conventional wisdom when we started doing this whole project was that the United States would be hurt as much or perhaps even more than China as a result of undertaking that kind of an action. Now, you might guess, just based off of the first half of this presentation, that that's probably not the case. The United States has a tremendous amount of economic power, and we think that would actually allow it to inflict really disproportionate harm upon China. And so that's kind of what you can see in this chart here. We wound up modeling the economic costs of a conflict along two time horizons. The first is the short run, so the weeks and months following a conflict and then a resultant disruption to trade, and then also in the long run. So that's kind of meant to get at the long run equilibrium that the world economy would settle at once trade barriers have been imposed and if they are maintained. So this slide here is the short run, and we basically looked at a ton of different scenarios in which the US and China could see their trade disrupted during a conflict. One of the parameters that we varied is whether or not Taiwan is able to continue its trade with the rest of the world during a conflict. We all know that Taiwan is really instrumental to semiconductor production. It being taken, quote unquote, offline would have a lot of costs for the world economy. And so that's what we show in the top part of this slide here. We also model scenarios in which Taiwan is kept, quote unquote, online, so it's able to retain its trade with the rest of the world and act with the United States to impose sanctions. That's what you can see, the bottom part, this slide here. We also look at the intensity with which the United States and its allies would be sanctioning China. Basically, the top sections of this slide correspond to the lowest intensity. The bottom sections correspond to the highest intensity, culminating in an American naval blockade of China during a conflict. And that might seem like it's outside of our current Overton window, but I think it is worth noting that in most great power conflicts, one side is acted to restrict the trade of the other. So that's what we have in terms of how we set up these scenarios. We also have different versions of this model that we're running. We have a baseline version and then an enhanced production disruptions version that basically just accentuates the losses that countries would experience from trade disruptions and then supply chain disruptions. So that shows higher losses. But the basic point of all of these numbers up here is really just that the United States loses substantially less than China does across virtually all of the scenarios that we model. The low end, it loses 5 times less than what China loses. At the high end, 11 times less when it imposes a blockade on China, and China really loses all of its trade with the rest of the world. So the results here are not pretty at all for China. The next question is what the global losses from such an action look like, right? And so this slide here is just meant to show what the global effects of that kind of a blockade action would be. I think one of the most interesting things about this is just that, yes, the United States loses less than China, but the United States, interestingly, also loses less than almost all of the rest of the world. You can see that its allies in Europe suffer more, as do especially its allies in Eastern Asia, which have quite a bit of trade with China. And you might wonder why that is. One of the big reasons is just that trade as a share of American GDP is relatively small in comparison to many other countries. The US has a massive internal market, so trade as a share of GDP for America is around 25%. For a country like Germany or South Korea, it's close to 100%, and they also happen to trade a lot with China. So the United States and its allies could impose a really heavy economic burden on China if it were to do something like invading Taiwan, but it's worth noting that America's allies would bear an especially large portion of that load. And then what about the long run? Just to quickly go through this, we wound up using a trade model from the literature in international economics to basically understand the long-run equilibrium that the world economy would return to if trade barriers between the United States and China are left in place. The bottom line there is that the U.S. and most of its allies return to kind of their baseline growth trajectory after a while, but China, on the other hand, really does suffer in the long term. It sees a sustained kind of dent to its GDP. And this is now a bit separate from the model, but one of the big reasons that we think that China would suffer really severe long-term losses is just that the Chinese economy is very dependent on foreign parts and components and also foreign firms that are operating there. For example, there are firms that are headquartered in the United States or in allied countries that are manufacturing in China. Think General Motors or Tesla as examples of that. There are also firms that are non-Chinese but that are contracting for these other foreign firms, like Foxconn, for example. And then finally, there are Chinese firms that act as subcontractors to a lot of these other firms. And all of these are really dependent on this globalized, American-dominated ecosystem. And if the United States and China were to get into a conflict with one another, these foreign firms will really be under no obligation to stay, right? They're not headquartered in China. Market conditions dictate that they should leave. They will eventually leave. If their home governments say that they should leave, they will need to leave. The Chinese firms that are left, many of them depend on foreign parts and components that are coming from America and its allies. Steve talked about this earlier. American firms are really dominant in the high technology sectors in particular, which China needs to sustain much of its economic growth. So, the scenarios that we've covered thus far have been universally pretty abysmal for China, but there are scenarios under which the U.S. really wouldn't have a significant advantage. We didn't write the title of this yesterday or anything, but a unilateral decoupling by the United States. So when the United States is just acting alone to cut China off is not going to inflict disproportionate harm upon China. America's losses in that scenario would be around 70% as high as those of China. So again, the harm is not all that great. This wouldn't be perhaps an especially effective tool for the United States to use to constrain Chinese revisionism. It needs to work with its allies. Which then really brings us to the final portion of this presentation, which is what are the conditions under which the United States and its allies should be using their economic leverage. Once again, we didn't write this yesterday. We think that a peacetime decoupling between the United States and China would be unwise. One reason is that the United States needs its allies to participate in this kind of an action, and there probably wouldn't be enough of a perception of threat from China in peacetime for those allies to want to cooperate with the United States and suffer heavy economic losses in imposing trade cutoff. That's one reason. The other is that China really can only be cut off once, right? It would suffer massive economic losses if it were to undertake some kind of territorial revisionism. But if it's already cut off, well, its economy will be in the dumpster, but it's not going to suffer a lot of additional losses from revisionism, right? One of the big constraints to aggressive Chinese action is going to have been removed. And in that same vein, if China starts to get cut off by the US and its allies, and it knows that it's going to be suffering disproportionate harm as a result of that, it may actually perceive a closing window of opportunity where its power is as close to that of the US and its allies as it ever will be, and where it therefore needs to act in the immediate term in order to secure its aims in the international system. But there are definitely scenarios under which it does make sense for the US and its allies to use this tool. And that is especially true in a wartime scenario in which China is acting aggressively. And one of the main reasons for that is sunk costs. If China were to act aggressively and invade Taiwan and cut Taiwan off from the world economy, even temporarily, the losses that would come from that would be really massive. We calculate that those losses could be almost as high as a partial trade cutoff by the United States and its allies of China itself. The US and its allies would be experiencing a huge amount of pain, basically, even if they do nothing and China invades Taiwan. And that means that the additional pain that they might incur if they were to actually cut China off could be marginal, right? They might actually perceive that as being worthwhile if they can punish China to the extent that China reconsiders the aggression altogether. The same thing really does apply for US allies, right? Like, obviously, Korea doesn't want to take a 25% hit to its GDP, but if it's already taking a 10% hit to its GDP or a 15% hit as a result of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, then it actually might be on board with those kinds of sanctions. And so a wartime decoupling could be a really effective tool to constrain Chinese revisionism. If China knows that it's going to be suffering very heavy losses as a result of aggression, our hope is that it could reconsider doing that altogether. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these policy implications, but I will leave them up on the screen. These are what we think the US should know and consider doing as a result of the analysis of this book. Fear not, we also have a slide that outlines the policy implications for China. We're happy to talk about those as well. We think that there are lessons from this book for both sides. But while you're reading and digesting that, I think Steve and I are both happy to take questions. All right.